Hey everybody, and welcome back to another Dark Souls 3 video. This is going to be the second video in hopefully a series of 3 where I go into the different things I liked about Dark Souls 3 compared to Dark Souls 1 and 2 and why it's, I think, the best game out of the series, right? We aren't going to really talk too much about Bloodborne, Demon Souls, and then I didn't play Sekiro or Elden Ring yet, so those are kind of out of the equation. But for right now, I think Dark Souls 3 is the best out of the FromSoft games. That might change as we go on, as we know, but today we're going to be talking about locations, kind of going into what I think were the best opening areas, how the bad areas went in every game, and then we can look at the better overall areas, like the in-between areas between important parts of the game and then the important parts of the game themselves, the important locations, and then we can talk about DLCs at the end, which is going to be really fun. So if you guys are interested in that, please continue watching, and thank you guys so much for being here, and we will hop right into it. So when we talk about locations in the Dark Souls series, I don't think Dark Souls 3 is going to win in every category at all, right? But I don't think it has to in order to be the best. I think it just has to win the most overall. But definitely when we talk about opening areas, I don't think Dark Souls 3 really shines too much, right? If we think about, in my opinion, of course, if we think about like the places that you start at, like the Undead Asylum or the Things Betwixt or Cemetery of Ash, I think the Undead Asylum of Dark Souls 1 is the coolest in my opinion, to kind of be this locked up character that gets to escape, and then you go from that to, you know, basically fighting God is pretty cool. Kind of happens in all the games, right? You start as this low character and then you go fight God, but I think there's a lot more like kind of lore and backstory that you can kind of put into your head about the character in an Undead Asylum than just somebody who like rose up from the grave or is just wandering around and found himself in the Things Betwixt, right? I don't really like those kind of openings, right? I guess you could say that in Dark Souls 3 you were a candidate to be a Lord of Cinder and then failed, so there's a lot to that, how you went out and hunted souls but then failed at the end. So I mean, I guess you do have some backstory, but just in terms of like the world and where everything is, right, I think being in that Undead Asylum is kind of the coolest start, and like this kind of jailbreak that you go on to get out of your imprisonment, and then because that's kind of the whole point of the game, right, is that you're imprisoned by this dark sign, and then in Dark Souls 1 you actually get to like literally break out of your confinement at the start of the game. So I think that's really cool. It's my favorite opening, I think. But then if we move on to hubs, right, kind of the Firelink shrine areas, I think Dark Souls 2 Majula has a special place in my heart for the hubs of the Dark Souls games, right? I think it's just one of the most calmest like places of rest that you could have. It's got the cool scenery, it's got the sun, it's got the ocean, and it's kind of in the middle of everything. There's so many different ways you can go at the start of Dark Souls 2, and it's all just stemming from Majula. So I think in terms of like the hub areas, I think Majula is the coolest. I know it's kind of the same with Dark Souls 1. There's a lot of different places you can go, but to me it's a pretty drab area, which again is kind of the point of the Dark Souls game, is that you're kind of at the end of the world anyway. But I think Majula just kind of gives you this kind of sneak peek at what the world could be if everything wasn't going to shit. So it's kind of cool, it's calm, it's nice, and the music's good. So I think Majula kind of takes the cake there in terms of the hub areas. Again, I think Firelink Shrine Dark Souls 3 is just, it's kind of gray, which again is the point of the game, but in terms of being an area that you just kind of teleport out to, I don't mind, again, the teleporting, as I've talked about before, but I think it just kind of, for being a hub area, it's kind of lacking, right? You don't really hang out there as much. There's not much to do there besides for, you know, upgrading stuff and buying stuff. I think in the other hubs, there was more, like, feeling of what's going on there, right? So I think just in terms of being a hub area for the game, I think Dark Souls 2 Majula is definitely the winner there. But I think when it comes to the first area of the game, so, like, you have the starting area, and then you make it to the shrine area, and then you go out into the world, right? It's kind of hard to place the first area for Dark Souls 2. I would say the first area for Dark Souls 2, I'm just going to put it as the Forest of the Fallen Giants. I know that you can go so many different ways, but definitely the first way that I go when I play is usually Forest of the Fallen Giants, just because it's, I think, the easiest. But so we'll count that as the first area, and then Dark Souls 3, you have the High Wall of Lothric, and Dark Souls 1, again, you can go different ways, but I would say like the Undead Burg is kind of the first place that you go. So we're going to count those as the first areas, and I think the High Wall of Lothric is kind of the coolest to start into. I think starting on the castle already is so cool, and then going out into the world to do what you need to do, and then coming back to finally get the last Lord of Cinder is super sick. But just starting in that castle setting kind of gives more of a presence, and that this is like a big thing going on, you know, coming out of an asylum like that and beating the demon, and then just kind of going to this undead berg that's full of all these other undead that are pretty low level. Like, it's, I don't know, it's kind of like underwhelming, I think, for Dark Souls 1. I know it's a starting area, like it's got to be decently easy. Like High Wall of Lothric isn't hard, but it does have like those Man of Pus enemies that pop up. If you don't know about them, they'll kind of knock you around, and then you move on. And then you have the cooler knights, I think, you know, the more experienced knights, and I think they just give you more in the High Wall of Lothric area than just these regular enemies, right? I think in Dark Souls 1 you kind of just get these basic enemies. They might have a little stronger weapon here and there, but other than that, they're all just kind of the same. Similar with Dark Souls 2, Force of the Fallen Giants, it's just these kind of, they do a little bit more, they have a little bit variety of the enemies, but I think High Wall of Lothric, or you even get like bigger enemies at the start that you kind of don't want to fight yet unless you're played through the game a bit. They have the bigger enemies with the axes, they have the Mana Pus enemies, they have even like special knights, right, that can do a lot of damage. So I think in terms of like making it a more interesting area to be, I think the High Wall of Lothric kind of takes that for being on like the wall of the castle, and you have all these different knights going on that you can fight, right? I think it just gives more of a presence than Dark Souls 1 and 2 like first areas. So I think Dark Souls 3 does have the best like first real area that you go into. And yeah, so that's the opening areas, right? We can move on to the bad areas now. When you talk about the bad areas of Dark Souls, of any Dark Souls games, right, there's a lot that comes to mind here. There's like always a swampy poison area, right? There's like Blight Town, or like the Black Gulch, or like Farron Keep and stuff like that. So just when we talk about these, I kind of am going to be like, this one was the least annoying to play. That's kind of my like scale for these areas, because they're all going to be kind of annoying at some point, right? Because they're the swampy poison areas of the game that are kind of very annoying to play through. But just in terms of being the least annoying, right, I think Farron Keep in that area in Dark Souls 3 and the Catacombs of Carthus also are kind of less annoying to play, because I think in the Farron Keep, like, your only job in there, unless you want to go and collect items, if you want to do that, then it gets a little more annoying. But just in terms of getting through it, right, you just have to turn off the 3 candles, and then you can go to the Abyss Watcher, and there's a bonfire there kind of in the middle too. So I mean, it's not as bad, I think, as like Blight Town, right? Because I think in Blight Town, if you play through the normal way, right, if you don't have the master key and go through the back way, and where you can go down the windmill, right, that kind of makes it a lot easier. You skip a lot of Blight Town doing that. If you just go the normal way through the depths down into Blight Town, right, that run down there is always annoying, like no matter how many times I played Dark Souls 1, and at this point I've played it a couple times, right? I've only beaten it once, but I played up to that point a couple times, and that's kind of where most of my runs fall off, is because like getting through Blight Town is just consistently awful, right? It doesn't really matter what your build is, as far as I know, like unless you really know how to get down it, right, it just is always going to be an annoying run. And even probably if you know it very well, there's always something that can go wrong in that area. Like, it's just terrifying and terrible to get down. And it's kind of the same with the Catacombs, in my opinion. Obviously, if any of you have watched like my first real video on Dark Souls, it was about getting stuck in the Catacombs, because I hadn't really gotten there yet in terms of Dark Souls on my first playthrough of beating it. So I got stuck there for like 4 hours. I definitely don't like the Catacombs, but also it's like super dark, and the enemies there are just giant skeletons that hit really hard. And if you do want to go get some of the embers that are down there, right, you have to go run around in this place that just kind of sucks, right? It's dark. Unless you, again, it's like one of those things, like unless you really know the path, like you're always gonna have trouble down there. But I think in like Farron Keep and Catacombs of Carthus, like it's bright enough for you to like walk around and kind of get what's going on, right? You can wander around. I did miss, like, it is confusing, the Catacombs of Carthus in Dark Souls 3. I did miss like Henri's NPC locations and stuff like that, but it wasn't hard to get through. And like same with Farron Keep, like I said, if you just put out the lights and go through, like, you're generally fine. And then there's probably, from what I've seen on the internet, like the worst runs are like the Gutter and the Black Gulch in Dark Souls 2. Like, if you aren't just trying to haul ass through that, like, it's just gonna be awful. If you're actually trying to get through it and like beat enemies and like find items, like the Black Gulch and the Gutter are just awful, right? It's just, there's too much going on. There's everything spitting poison at you. There's like hands that come out of oil. Like, it's just a mess. There's invasions that happen, NPC invasions on top of that. Like, it's really just not great. And then there's also, I guess you could talk about Dark Souls 2, Seldora, right? I kind of actually like Seldora a little bit, just in terms of like, if we're gonna look at it as a location, like, it is a cool location. I think it's like a decently like nice looking area. Like, sure, it's bogged down because they just throw a bunch of enemies at you that shoot long projectiles, and then they have large tanky enemies that kind of keep you in one area while these other guys jump at you from the water. But like, if you just look at the area, like, it's pretty cool. Like, you start in this like army camp, and then you go down, and then there's all these pretty lights, and then there's that nice water area. Like, I don't know, like, in terms of looks, it's pretty cool. So I don't put it as like super awful. I know a lot of people do, but again, in terms of just getting through the level, they're all going to be kind of annoying poison swamp areas that aren't very fun to look at. But I think Farron Keep, at least it's nice, and it's there's a path through it that's pretty decently easy, no matter how you do it, as long as you know these 3 locations. The Catacombs of Karthus, kind of same, right? It's bright enough for you to get through. The enemies aren't too annoying. I think in terms of just bad areas, I think Dark Souls 3 has the least worst, which doesn't mean it's the best game, but it does help, right, to have the least annoying areas. Those were just the areas in Dark Souls 3 that were annoying to me. I know there's probably other areas that people don't like doing, but for me, those were the areas that I found the most annoying in all the games, and I think Dark Souls 3 had the least annoying areas. It's kind of the point I'm trying to make. But now we can go into the middle areas, right? Those kind of areas that connect different things to, like, the main areas, like the castles and stuff. Like, every game has one. So I think in Dark Souls 3, like, what we're kind of comparing here is like the Road of Sacrifices in Boreal Valley. I guess you could say Boreal Valley is kind of an important place, but in terms of like linking you to the like Lothric Castle is what I'm kind of getting at here, versus like the Huntsman's Copse and Seldora, and then the depths and like Darkroot Basin. Those are kind of the middle areas that I'm like comparing. My least favorite, I think, are the depths and Darkroot Basin. Dark Souls 1, like, connecting areas I think are very bland. Like the Darkroot Basin and Darkroot Garden are just very lame in my opinion. Like, you fight like the original classes in them, and then you go and fight Sif, which kind of sucks because he's Doggo and we love Doggo. But those in between, like, there's nothing really going on at Darkroot Basin. Like, I know it's how you get to the DLC and stuff, but it's got the Hydra. But I mean, it's just pretty bland. Like, it's just like this green rock formation with some trees and golems, and it's just like, that's it. It almost seems like an MMO area, I don't know, like where you just go and grind enemies, and it's like there's not much there but just mobs. So it's kind of, in my opinion, lacking. Same with the depths. The depths is just kind of the sewers with rats. I mean, it's better than Darkroot Basin. It's less bland, but again, there's not much going on there. The Huntsman's Copse was just super annoying in my opinion to get through. I didn't like Huntsman's Copse at all, but it is, I think, has more going on, is a bit more interesting than the Darkroot Basin. Like, there's all the bridges going different ways. There's all those little like huts that they're trapped in, and the lore behind the area is pretty sick. Like, that's where they all gathered the undead, and then that's where they have Undead Purgatory, which is one of the dumber bosses in Dark Souls 2. But yeah, it's just those areas aren't as interesting. Like I said, Seldora is cool. I do like how it looks as a connecting area, in my opinion. But yeah, again, it's kind of brought down by the enemies, and it being kind of annoying to get through all of the different variations of enemies, and they throw so much at you, and they aggro for so long and stuff like that, and you fight this weird toad at the end. But oh no, I don't think it's that bad compared to like Depths, Darkroot Basin, and Huntsman Copse. Like, getting through those suck. But I really like the Road of Sacrifices is really cool. I know it's like a swampy area, but it's not poison swamp. But the enemies there are cool. There's the giant crabs, right? There's the giant guys with the sticks. A lot of invasions happen there, which is fine. It's a good place for PvP. There's some NPC fights, which are fun. But I think it's a cool area to get through, right? You can talk to Henri, stuff like that. And then same with like Irithyll, Boreal Valley, coming out of the catacombs, right? You cross this cool bridge. There's a bunch of different places to go. There's the like place under the bridge. There's going up to fight the Pontiff. Going down into the dungeon area is cool too. So I think just in terms of that, like, there's a bunch more going on in these little middle areas before getting to the castle. And then we can talk about the castles themselves, right? Lothric Castle, Anor Londo, and Dragonless Castle. I think I never really liked Anor Londo Castle. I think the big reveal of flying over the hill and seeing it, I never thought it was that great, because when you actually get in there, there's not much going on. Like, it's pretty bland in Anor Londo, just in terms of what's happening in this castle. Like, if you compare it to like Lothric Castle, like Lothric Castle feels like a castle. Like, you go up there, there's dragons guarding the gate, you got to run through all these different areas full of enemies and knights, and like there's the gardens, there's, you know, all these steps you have to go through to get to the main part of the castle. And then in Anor Londo, it's really just like the one room with the painting, and then the like spinning spiral staircase, and then you're kind of at the steps. You have to go all the way around, but it's mainly just that section, and there's not much like going on there. As far as I could tell, I just thought that it was very bland. Dragonless Castle is kind of the same. I mean, it's got more depth to it, I think. Like, you can go down, like, it's not that great, but I just, in terms of like setting, I do like that it's like raining and stuff like that, and it's pretty dramatic, right? You go in through that little tunnel, and then all of a sudden it's raining and it's lightning, and it's like, it's a really cool like build up to the castle, but then actually getting to the castle is kind of lame again. Like, I think that they just kind of drop the ball on these castles, because they don't really like feel like castles, in my opinion, except for Lothric Castle. For some reason, I get the feeling that like this is a castle, just because there's so much different areas going on in it. That kind of gives it the feel that it is a big place, and I just feel like Anor Londo and Dragonless Castle are pretty like on train tracks on where you go, and it's like, oh, you go down and then you go up and then you go back down, or you just go straight through and fight Ornstein and Smo. And then in terms of bosses, like Ornstein and Smo is kind of, it's fun, but it's kind of just not as interesting. Dragonless Castle bosses, the Looking Glass Knight, just another large piece of armor, or the like 2 Dragon Slayer armors, right? Not very interesting bosses at Dragonlink Castle. And then again, Lothar Castle, I really like. Was it Osiris the Consumed King? That's a cool boss fight. I really think that that's a really fun fight. And that leads you to like the shadow area of Firelink Shrine, which is cool. And that's in the gardens, right? And then you can go up and you can actually fight the twin princes, right? Which is super cool. I like that fight. It's one of my favorite ones. So I think, again, just in terms of like Lothar Castle, just in terms of being the big area, right? The big kingdom area is like Lothar Castle does that the best, in my opinion. And then we can get to like the final ends, right? All the kilns of the First Flame, right? You kind of, again, we'll talk about the Throne of Want in Dark Souls 2, right? It's not really the kiln. I know it looks like a kiln, but it's more of a throne, and I think it's more of a like metaphor for having a choice. How I see the Dark Souls 2 lore ending is that like when you take the throne, kind of like you're becoming a champion of Ash, like you've become a Lord of Cinder, but like you can choose to light the fire or not, and that's kind of how the Lord of Cinders came to be, is that some chose not to, even though they got the throne. But that last area, I think it's pretty underwhelming, right? It's just kind of this large bland room, right? It's not a very interesting area to be in. I think the coolest part about it is the walk down to the door. I think Dark Souls 2 actually does like build-ups pretty good, right? Like the build-up to Dragonlink Castle is cool. The build-up to the like dragon area is really cool when you cross the bridge, but then actually getting to those areas is usually pretty bland. Dark Souls 1, Kiln of the First Flame, kind of similar, again, great walk up, but then you get there and it's kind of just the bonfire and Gwyn, and then you light the fire and everything explodes, or you walk away. But I think the atmosphere of the Kiln of the First Flame in Dark Souls 3 is super cool, right? There's ash all around you, there's the dark sign in the sky, right? And you're fighting all these different archetypes of all the Lords of Cinder who came before you. You get to see Gwyn. There's like swords everywhere of all the people that have gone and failed or gone and relit and left their sword. Like there's so much in this final kiln that makes it feel like a cool last area. Also though, just as a like side note, because I like to do these sometimes, I really like the Lake of Ash in Dark Souls 1. I think it's such a cool area. I know that there's not a lot there. You just kind of have these piles of sand and like the long pillars that go off into infinity, and there's like a Hydra and then the Dragon Covenant. In terms of looking at it, I really like the Lake of Ash in Dark Souls 1. One of my favorite areas in the series. Not enough to make Dark Souls 3 second place though. So, but now we can move on to the DLC, which is going to be super fun to talk about. Again, this is going to be a little definitely opinionated, because there's some things that's hard to explain why I like one thing over another, but this is a video of personal preference. So we're going to start with Ulsil DLC, right, which is just a reskin, right? You go back in time kind of, and it's back in the Darkroot Garden, right, Darkroot Basin, so it's just kind of a reskin of that, and they don't do much to change it, which is why I don't really like it, right? Again, I didn't like Darkroot Garden anyway, so then having to go through a reskin, like paying for a reskin of that is just not fun for me. But again, you could be like, well, Dark Souls 3 like had a reskin of Van Orlando, and I think Dragonlink Castle, and it has all a bunch of areas from the other games, and so you paid for that, and it's like, well, but that's like the point of the game. Like the point of the game is that all these important areas are coming together, and also they're important areas that are being reskinned and kind of made fresh for this game. And like Darkroot Garden, I would say, is not a very important place in Dark Souls 1 to get a reskin, so I didn't love it that much. Yeah, it's just not that great. But once you hit the Artorias one, right, you fight him there, and then you move on to the Abyss, right? I think the Abyss area itself is super cool. It's one of the coolest areas in the series. That's where you see all the humanities running around. You can see kind of where the Dark Soul comes from. You can even see why like Gwyn might have feared the Dark Soul and this Abyss in this area, right, and tried to constantly keep it down. Then you fight Manus, which is a huge part of the lore of all the games, right? It's kind of once you fracture his soul, right, that's kind of the whole thing that like triggers Dark Souls 2, right, and all their DLCs, right? So it's a big fight in a cool area, and actually going down into the Abyss and seeing what it's like, I think is super interesting, and seeing how it corrupts the world and all that. It does do well in that back half of the DLC, but that first half, again, I think it just brings it down. Being just a reskin of a poor area is kind of tough, right, for me to say that it's good. But then there's the Dark Souls 2 DLCs, which I think, you know, it's tough to say that it's better than the Ulasil DLCs because a lot of it's trash, but in terms of like lore, there are some cool areas. I think my favorite is the Sunken City, right? Going down through all those pyramids, it's really cool. And all the spinning blocks, I know it's kind of weird, puzzly, gimmicky, but like getting through all that is kind of fun and interesting. It's a little fresher than I would say some of the other DLCs, and then you actually get to meet a dragon from the ancient times, from that time of Grey, right? Because as far as I know, reading the descriptions, like that's what they were trying to use. We're trying to use the blood of an ancient to ascend themselves out of the cycle, right? And that's kind of how they messed up, and then everything was sunken into poison. poison because the dragon woke up and then poisoned everything. So, and it's kind of a cool area to look at, like this underground, like mausoleum type area. Like it's pretty cool. And then you get to fight a dragon at the end, which is great. I didn't really like the old Iron King DLC, right? I think that's pretty bland. The only cool part is like walking across the chain. Other than that, it's just like pretty straightforward. I don't know. There's enemies, you fight them, it's done. That's about it. The Elumlois one, right? The Burnt Ivory King is the only cool part about that is the fight at the end. Getting all of the knights to drop in with you is one of the coolest moments in the game, right? But other than that, the area is trash. It's absolute garbage, right? The Frozen Outskirts is horrifying. It's just literally hell frozen over. It's just pointless and annoying and awful, and you should never go there, and I will hopefully never go there again. Oh, it's getting to me. Oh, I'm going hollow. Ever. So I don't like that DLC, obviously. But just in terms of, since we're talking about locations, just to look at it, I don't think it's very fun to look at, right? The Frozen Outskirts is literally just blinding snow and like rubble out there. But I know there's more to the DLC, right? You do have the entire like kingdom of Elumlois that you get to wander around, but again, it's mostly frozen, which is the gimmick of that one, that you have to like basically turn the heat on and then things melt and you can go back and find stuff. But other than that, it's pretty drab. Like it's not a very interesting area. It's just snow and enemies, and that's about it. Kind of my same problem with Dark Souls 3 Painted World of, I think they're Ariandel, right? Is kind of the same part, like getting up to that, like the chapel or wherever she's at, right? It's just it's kind of like Dark Root Basin, right? It's just, instead of green rocks, it's snowy rocks and enemies and trees, and that's about it. And these trees shoot fire, which is cool. And then there's a giant wolf every once in a while. Again, the saving grace for that area is, one, the final fight has a really cool area that you fight in. I really like that. And then the like library area where the girl is painting, I think is also really cool. Those little areas are sick, but the in-between running around is just awful. It's kind of drab and pointless, and it's just trees, enemies, and white rocks. So again, not that fun. But the one area that is good is when you climb all the way down into the like frozen lakeish river area, and then you have to fight the guy with the wolf. I always forget his name because he's not a very big boss, but that area, that location, I think is really cool. It's got the grave, it's got the flowers, right? I think it's a cool area, honestly, for a fight. Like as an arena, it's really interesting and cool. But the rest of the area is, again, drab until you get to the like main library and the chapel area, right? And then you have the godforsaken like bug area underneath, which is god awful. But so there's like 3 saving graces for that, but other than that, it's not that good. And then you get to the Ring City DLC, which is probably the best DLC, I think, for all of them. To see the world pretty much ending is the point of this, right? You're kind of at the end of time. For the Ring City, kind of it's at the edge of the world, and now you're at the end of time, and it's kind of like everything's just collapsing around you, and it's really cool, like end of the world feeling, right? You get to fight with Gale literally at the end of time. Like you're kind of the last 2 people essentially alive. Gale's kind of killed everybody else for the Dark Soul, and then it's just you and him duking it out for this pigment that will kind of repaint a world. Like it's cool, there's lightning, it's just endless expanse of ash. Like it's a really cool area in boss fight. I really like that area. But then there's also the like poison swamp area. Again, not super interesting, but again, you can spend as much time as you want there. Again, it's a cool change that I think that I liked about Dark Souls 3 is they're kind of annoying areas. They at least allow you to spend as much time there as you want. If you want to go find all the items and stuff, you can do that. If you want to go fight all the things, you can do that. If it's annoying to you to get through, then you can just run through it. But like the knights that are there, like the enemies walking around with the dark sign in them, getting that armor super cool, right? I had it on as soon as I got it. There's like the purging stone. There's a bunch of different stuff to do there, right? It's not that straightforward. You can fight Midir, which is a really cool boss fight. Somehow I managed to beat him in 2 goes, which is crazy because I'd never fought him before. But I think I got really lucky with his moveset. I think he just kind of tweaked out, and I just stayed underneath him for the most part, and he kind of only did a couple moves over and over again. It was a long fight, but it worked out. But again, really cool area to fight him in. Typical dragon boss area where it's just a large open area with some water. But in terms of location, right, there's a bunch going on. Again, one of the coolest parts of this, I think, is when you go drop down to fight the Demon Prince in the DLC, right, as you get out of the drag heap, you're actually fighting on the, like, rubble and ashes of the Dark Souls 1 Firelink Shrine, which I didn't know until after I beat it, and I think that's, like, it's even cooler, like, that you're, like, ending the bloodline or the fire line of the demon race, like, on the ashes of, like, where you probably lit your first bonfire, right, or I guess your first Firelink Shrine, right, like, that first hub you've ever been to is like where you end the Demon Prince line. Like it's really cool. I like that the fight's there, knowing that now. Again, stuff like that, the end of the world fight, like just those locations they're really interesting. Those are the DLCs. That's all I have for locations. Let me know what you guys think. I know that there's a lot of other locations that are interesting. I honestly like Dark Souls 2, No Man's Wharf. I actually like that area. I know it's kind of weird conceptually of how it's there, but it is, I think, really cool, an area to walk out to. There are cool areas in other games, but I think, again, in terms of doing the best, I think Dark Souls 3 does it, and doing doing the least worst. Dark Souls 3 does it. It doesn't win everywhere, like I said. Like it doesn't have the best hub in my opinion. It doesn't have the best opening area, right? It does have the best first kind of real area you go to. It's got kind of the best DLCs areas in my opinion. And then even like if we want to say like in terms of reskins, right? It does have, I think, better reskins. Again, like I said, I don't like the Ulasil Darkroot Basin. The areas in between I think are good because you can spend as much time as you want there, right? If you want to just get through it, you can, right? As opposed to like constantly dying in like the catacombs or gutter, the gulch, right? Like getting through those always sucks, but I think the sucky areas you can get through easily. So that's my opinion on why Dark Souls 3 has kind of the better locations. And then the next video we'll probably get into the combat, which I think is gonna be super interesting. But for now, that is all I have for Dark Souls 3 locations. Thank you guys again so much for watching. If you have a favorite location of your own, please feel free to drop it. Or if you think one of the areas that I said I liked isn't very good, please let me know. Anything like that. Again, always love to hear back from you guys, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye.